It's time for another edition of Lewis at Large, 60 minutes of smart talk radio featuring guests from all walks of life in conversation with your host, Warner Lewis. So sit back and lend us your ears for the next hour. Now here with today's first guest is the host of Lewis at Large, Warner Lewis.
Well, welcome everybody to another segment of Lewis at Large. Yours truly, Warner Lewis from the flight deck, and as always, that means some smart talk radio is in your future, and this segment should be a good one indeed. We're going to be talking to Ann Trubek. Who's Ann Trubek? She is a journalist. She taught college level. Well, we'll talk about what she taught at the college level, but she now writes extensively and has a brand new work out called The History and Uncertain Future of Handwriting. I've got a feeling she and I may share some views the same here. Should be fun. Ann, how are you, my friend?
I'm great. Thanks so much.
Well, let's do this. Before we dive into a discussion of handwriting in the book, let's find out a little bit more about you. Tell us a little bit about your professional history. Again, you taught at the college level, but tell us a little bit more about how the professional path you took to get to writing this book.
Sure. I was an academic. I got a PhD in English, and then I taught college, and my research focus was the history of the book. And how, books have changed over the years and their cultural significance. And part of that, of course, was writing books. And so I was very interested in the questions of how people wrote at different times over the centuries. And I'm doing this work at a time where our current writing practices have been completely overturned. There's just been this huge revolution in writing. And so it was just this sort of, wow, the present is really, fascinating. And if you look at the past, you can understand the present better. And that's how it all came together.
What did you go into this with a particular point of view, or did you go in with completely an open mind and said, okay, I'm going to start diving into what handwriting really historically has really been all about in its evolution. Let's see what happens.
I definitely came in with it. I sense that there was so much anxiety out there about handwriting. It's a little different. When I started this project, people's relationship to handwriting was a little different than it was today. But there was just so much worry and anxiety and this sort of sense like this was a bad thing, that we were handwriting less, and that it was going to have all these negative consequences. And at the same time, I had a young son in elementary school, and I saw how much time is spent on handwriting in those young grades. And I thought, one, don't be anxious, because I know from the history of writing that everyone gets anxious during times of transitions, and then it pretty much works out okay. And two, I was like, wow, handwriting is not going to be something that my son is going to use much in his adult life. Why is so much time being spent on it in schools? And so those were the two sorts of arguments that I came to the research with, and wanted to leave readers with a sense that it's okay.
Right. Okay. And let me ask you something. Let's just sort of tackle these sort of one by one, I guess, a little bit. And the obvious one is more and more school districts are dropping the writing or the teaching of writing cursive writing. A, in your opinion, is that a good thing? And B, if we drop it, does that mean it goes away completely, or will it live on somehow?
Right. Yes, I think it is a fine thing for schools to no longer assess students on how well they master cursive script. I don't think it's a problem for them to stop testing kids on how great their cursive is. And no, it doesn't mean it's going to go away. There are many, many things that we all do that aren't taught in elementary school. People can teach themselves cursive at any point that they want. We used to teach home ec and sewing in schools, and we don't teach them anymore, but people still cook and make clothes. So yes, it will not go away. People are choosing not to use it much anymore, and I think people will continue to choose not to use cursive very much. I don't think that's going to stop, but it's also not going to go away completely.
What about those that would say when cursive handwriting goes away, there will be no such thing as, and again, this may be a relic that drops off on the side of the road, What happens to the handwritten thank you note? What happens to things we can just write down on our own, our ability to write down versus speak into a computer or a phone or some other kind of electronic device? Is there anymore a need to learn handwriting at all?
Not much of one. Not much of one. I mean, the handwritten note, I think what is valuable to us about receiving, a thank you note in the mail is that it shows that the person took time. Because we know that it takes more time to write, in a card and put on a stamp and write the address than it does to send an email. There are other ways to show that we are spending more time and attention on something that's important to us other than putting some ink scratches onto a piece of paper. We could send them a bunch of cookies, handmade some cookies and, show our appreciation in other ways. So, I think that is fine. And people are always asking me, what about this? What about that? If it goes away and we don't know how to do it. But for the most part, we have substitutes for anything that we might want to handwrite. The doctor's script, the doctor's prescription is one that comes up all the time. Well, I don't remember the last time a doctor handwrote a prescription for me. She just puts it in a computer and then prints it out. So it's, the list is shrinking of things that you really do need handwriting for.
Was it possible? I believe this. I do believe that at least for prior generations, growing up or starting off and then ultimately evolving, that someone would look at their signature and that would be a part of their identity, a way in which they could be identified, such as an autograph. If handwriting goes away in the future, will we care about autographs?
Yeah, that's a great question. Our signatures, that's a very cultural thing and it's a very specific thing to the West in the last couple hundred years. Before then, there wasn't this idea that the signature was a sense of your identity. I think now it's it doesn't have much legal status. I mean, IP addresses and credit card. What are those little those little doohickeys in a credit card?
The chips, the chips.
The chips?
Yes, chip technology, yes.
And SIM cards, those are much more reliable forms of identification than a signature is now. And I think, we used to love to, we still do, get autographs from celebrities and things like that, collect autographs. Now it's a selfie. Think about it. Everyone's like, oh, can I take a picture with you when they need a celebrity? They don't say, will you sign this napkin? They say, can I take a selfie? So I think that's what's replacing the autograph as a sort of, I was close to this famous person.
What about, and again, if you just joined us, we're talking to Ann Trubek. It's not Trubek, it's Trubek, right?
Yeah.
Ann Trubek, okay. By the way, you're the first Trubek we've ever had on this show, so we're 750-some shows into this thing, so there you go.
Thank you.
Yeah, well, she's the founder and director of Belt Publishing. She's also the editor-in-chief of Belt Magazine. She's published articles in the New York Times, The Atlantic, Wired, many others. Also taught college, and she is the author of a new work, a really nice one, actually, The History and Uncertain Future of Handwriting, and at some point she may write a book called The History and Uncertain Future of Books. So who knows? We don't know that yet. But and take us back. There is some extraordinary history that you've done a lot of research on here. When did handwriting really begin to be within human history? To be a form of communication and be identified with an individual?
That's a good question, and they have different answers. So the first writing system that we know about, was in Sumeria, which is sort of, we know about Iraq and Mesopotamia and the Fertile Crescent, that area. They were the first, we think, to develop writing, and it was a series of scratches in wet clay. It's called cuneiform. And people would take, a piece of clay, and they would take a stylus, like something that's like a pen, and just press into it and use different motions to make different symbols. And that was the first writing system. But what's incredible is that now clay, that they would bake it and the clay would harden. Clay is incredibly durable. So we have tons of cuneiform left. Archaeologists have found lots of it. People are still finding it. There's very little paper left. So even though cuneiform is 5,000 years old, we have more of it than we have, of 1,000-year-old writing. And scholars cannot identify any one writer from any other writer, because the people who were taught it, the literate people of the culture, were taught it so that their marks looked absolutely identical to everybody else's. It was not for them a sense of individuality at all. That idea that your script is related to you as an individual doesn't really show up until about the 19th century in the West. So a long time later, 6,000 years later.
Did handwriting and its importance and I guess its impact and significance, did it vary drastically from culture or geographical area to another? For example, was it different in the Orient versus Europe versus North America versus wherever? Tell us a little bit about that. Or did it sort of evolve as humanity evolved, so did handwriting?
Well, handwriting was, for most of human history, we could just call it writing, because there was no other way to write, right? That was the only way that sounds, the ways that sounds are heard, that are expressed in through signs on a durable surface, which is how we define writing. Until the invention of the printing press, in the 15th, 16th century, that's what it was. That's how we communicated through words, written words. What changes is the ways that we make those signs, whether you're using pens or brushes or pressing into clay. And then what changes is the relationship we have to it culturally. So, for instance, ancient Egypt was probably the most restricted civilization in terms of writing. Almost no one was taught how to write. You had to be of the most elite family, and you had to be male. So the number of literate people was just tiny, and writing for the Egyptians was definitely very related to religion. Scribes were somewhat sacred figures, although most of what they were writing was just bureaucracy and memos. This guy owes the temple this much, and that sort of stuff. And then in the Chinese and Islamic countries have a tradition of calligraphy, as well as Hebrew and Judaism, where the act of writing is also a very sacred spiritual act, and there are a lot of rules governing how and where it should happen. So all those things really change depending on the culture. But one thing that remains constant is that each invention of writing technology is aimed at trying to get us to do it faster. From the quill pen to the fountain pen to the ballpoint pen to the pencil, because we want to be able to catch up with how fast we can go in our heads with our tools for writing. And then, of course, the typewriter comes in and makes it much, much faster.
Again, we're talking with Ann Trubek, the history and uncertain future of handwriting, and again, the subject of handwriting itself is so vast. But let me see if this is one that you found in some of your research. What about those that used to be a really big deal for, especially many times for law enforcement authorities, and that was the science of identifying handwriting or reading handwriting, personal traits about that. Tell us a little bit about handwriting analysis.
Sure, yeah. There's actually two different strands. The police officers and stuff that happens in the courts it's called, this great term, forensic document examination. And that's sort of like, did Uncle Charlie really sign that will? Or was it, nephew John who forged his signature? And that's one whole strand. And then there's another strand that says, if you dot your I a certain way, or if you slant your writing a certain way, that tells us something about your personality. So if you are really anxious, you're going to have very small, cramped handwriting. And if you're real optimist, your slant will go upwards. That's called graphology. Graphology is kind of like astrology, right? I mean, it has as much scientific weight as, if you were born on June 30th, you're a Cancer. There's no science. There's no, what scientists today would consider science in graphology. The legal stuff, did Cousin John really sign that will or forge the signature? That also has some dubious standing. Usually when someone authenticates a piece of handwriting, it's not because of how the letters are made, but it's something like the paper that was used or the pen. Those are the things that you could say, aha, this was forged because we found this pen in your drawer and it's exactly the same ink that was used on this piece of paper.
What about also, what are you finding? You did a lot of research, I know, on this, but as you talk to academicians, you talk to handwriting experts, you talk to those that are talented with a quill and all of that, are they wringing their hands, and even the academic community, again, wringing their hands that, oh my gosh, we are letting something so wonderfully important and wonderfully personalized and unique slip through our fingers here, through the fingers of history? Or is this something that those people that have championed it, so to speak, are willing now to let it go?
That's a great question. I would say that, in the academy, no one's particularly worried about this. Outside, they definitely are. You mentioned that districts are no longer teaching cursive, but what we're seeing in the last couple of years is this huge backlash. There are huge numbers of bills being introduced into legislatures to put cursive back on the curriculum as a requirement, and there are a lot of states who have added it back in as a requirement. So there's a lot of people out there who are really, really upset about this and want to make sure it's preserved. Historians are not those people. They're not on the front line of this. It's more teachers and politicians and voters, as far as I can tell.
So again, kind of leaping back to some things you said earlier, we're willing to let go of, or are we willing to let go of handwriting, especially as it is an expression many times of a personality? And by that, I mean, again, you look at certain handwriting, you think, wow, this person, just by their writing, is probably organized and forthright, etc. This other person has lower self-esteem. This other person's a slob. You know what I'm talking about, etc.,
yeah.
etc. In terms of writing as a reflection of the person that wrote it.
Yeah, it's funny. When I first started writing about this topic, it was a long time ago, maybe 6 or 7 years ago, and people were really upset about that idea that we are going to lose this sense of expression of who we are through handwriting, and that was, just a terrible thing, and we'd all become robots, with keyboards. But the truth is, people don't get so upset about that anymore, and I think it's because they're all writing less, and they're finding that they still have individual identities, and it's okay. And they're all choosing handwriting less. I mean, that's one of the things that I think is really important. A lot of people get so upset about the idea that there's less handwriting, but they themselves are making a choice every single time they write to choose a keyboard instead of pen and paper.
Right.
Yeah, I mean, and no, it doesn't really show that you have low self-esteem if you cross your, T a certain way. There's no science to that.
Well, those of you that grew up writing, this has probably been an interesting conversation. You're probably thinking about it and thinking, who really thinks about handwriting? Well, for the last 20 minutes or so, we've been talking about handwriting. Those of you that grew up not handwriting much at all, this probably seems much ado about nothing. But the work is called The History and Uncertain Future of Handwriting. And Trubek is the author. And here's a question for you. I know you wrote the book probably primarily on a computer, but were there handwritten notes along the sides or on the galleys or in the columns somewhere from you? Could you have written this book without writing anything down?
Yeah, pretty much. Pretty much. I don't handwrite. The only thing I handwrite are my to-do lists, and that's just habit because I've always done that, and I just never, found anything on the computer that worked as well. And I write notes in the margins of books when I'm reading physical books. So I do that. But a lot of my research and writing and reading habits that I used to just do all with pen and paper, I transferred to the computer, and it's fantastic because it's much easier to find later, and I can read it easier. It's just a boon, the computer. And for writing, I revise compulsively. I will do 20, 30 drafts of everything that I write. The computer makes that a heck of a lot easier.
So will there come a day when certain people don't know what a number 2 pencil is?
Yeah. I would say there are some people who don't understand the number, the difference between a number 2 and a number 5.
Yeah, that's probably true.
Already.
That's probably true. I'm showing age
Although
there.
I will say that, K through 12, they still use pencil and writing almost all the time. And then the kids get to college and it's all computers and they're a little confused. So the public education is lagging behind what most of us are doing out in the world.
Right. Well, so what I think our guest has been telling us is notepads are still safe for the time being. Writing pads you can still buy pens and pens. Those won't go away. But at some point, hey, those sales will go down. There's no question about it. Based on kind of what you're saying, I would tend to agree with you. Now, listen. Before we get out of here, how can people get a copy of the book and also find out a little bit more about Anne Trubek, what do you do, and some of your other writings?
Sure, thanks. You can find the book wherever books are sold. I always suggest independent bookstores are a great place to go, but any place that sells books, we'll stock it. And you can find out more about me. I have a website at anntrubek.com. I also run a small press called Belt Publishing, which is focused on books about the Midwest, so your readers might find some of that interesting. And we have an online magazine at beltmag.com.
Okay, well, listen, thank you so much for sharing your time and insights with us, and would love to have you back on again sometime.
I'd love it. This has been a fantastic conversation.
Wonderful. We will be back with more Pen or Pen Not in Hand right after this on Lewis at Large.